What does a mosquito bite, the bark of an Andean tree, and a Dutch spirit from the 1600s have in common? They converged in a drink born from necessity, one that would eventually become a bar classic. Picture a weary British officer sweating through another feverish night, finding a moment of relief in a single bitter sip. But what's the unlikely connection holding all these pieces together? Tonight, we're tracing the true story of how medicine, empire, and survival shaped the gin and tonic, and why it's so much more than just a cocktail. Let's ease into the journey, starting where the danger was at its highest. Step ashore in the tropics, and you're hit with air so heavy it feels like you're breathing through a wet blanket. The sun is relentless. The nights offer no comfort, just more heat, more insects, and a constant sense that you're being watched by something you can't see. But the real threat isn't the climate or the wildlife. It's a danger that arrives quietly on the wings of a mosquito. One moment, it's just a tiny prick on your arm. The next, you're struck down with fever and debilitating weakness, your body racked by a sickness that seems to drain the life right out of you. For British colonizers in the early 19th century, malaria wasn't just a hazard. It was the enemy lurking in every shadow. This mosquito-borne disease didn't just make people ill, it killed them in staggering numbers. Malaria swept through armies and settlements, leaving behind empty beds and unfinished plans. The British Empire had big dreams. India, West Africa, the Caribbean, all glittering with promise. But every new outpost came with a price. Sometimes entire expeditions vanished, wiped out by what they called the fever. No one knew the true cause. Mosquitoes were just another annoyance, not the culprits. What they did know was that malaria didn't just attack individuals, it threatened the machinery of empire itself. Colonies faltered, trade routes closed, and the dream of global dominance started to look like a costly mistake. If you found yourself sick, your options were grim. The medical wisdom of the time offered a range of desperate and often harmful treatments, none of which worked. In some places, half the British settlers died in their first year. In West Africa, the numbers were even worse. Without a solution, the empire's expansion was at a standstill. The British needed a miracle. That miracle, as it turned out, had already existed for centuries, just not in Europe. High in the forests of the Andes, the Quechua people had long relied on the bark of the cinchona tree to treat fevers. They would grind the bark, mix it with water, and use it to ease the burning sickness that stalked their communities. This wasn't guesswork or superstition. It was knowledge built from generations of careful observation, passed down like a family recipe. The cinchona's pale bark and small white flowers didn't look like much, but to the Quechua, it was a lifeline. When Spanish invaders arrived in South America, they noticed how the local people handled fevers. They watched the Quechua use cinchona bark and saw that it worked. Soon, the Spanish were sending the bark back to Europe, where it picked up a new name, Jesuit's powder, thanks to the missionaries who helped spread the word. It wasn't long before European doctors realized this powder was the only thing that reliably brought relief from the ague. For some, its Catholic origins made it controversial, but when faced with malaria's grip, most people didn't care who discovered the cure. By the early 19th century, quinine, the key compound in cinchona bark, had become the gold standard for treating malaria. British soldiers stationed in the tropics received barrels of powdered quinine as part of their medical supplies. Medical handbooks praised it as a wonder drug. For the Empire, this was the breakthrough they'd been desperate for. Now, there was finally a way to fight back against malaria, to keep the dream of expansion alive. But there was a catch. Quinine worked, but getting people to take it was another story. The taste was, to put it mildly, awful. Imagine the most bitter thing you've ever tasted. Then imagine it's your only option for staying alive. Soldiers were told to dissolve quinine powder in water and drink it daily. It became a dreaded ritual. Some men would rather risk fever than face another dose. There are stories of entire regiments refusing to take their medicine, even as their numbers dwindled. The British, not known for giving up easily, tried to find ways to make quinine more palatable. They mixed it with anything they could find: honey, spices, even alcohol. Nothing really worked. The bitterness cut through everything. The only thing that made a difference was sugar. Dissolving quinine in sweetened water created something that could be choked down, if not exactly enjoyed. This was the first version of tonic water, though it was still flat and medicinal. Citrus offered another boost. The British Navy had already learned that lime juice could prevent scurvy, and adding it to the quinine mixture made the drink healthier and a little more bearable. By the time the British had established themselves in India and other tropical colonies, this sweetened, citrus-laced tonic water became part of the daily routine for officers and soldiers alike. It was medicine, but it was also a small comfort, proof that even in the most hostile environments, you could find a way to survive. Still, no one was reaching for a glass of tonic water for pleasure. It was all about necessity. The bitterness lingered, a constant reminder of the threat outside every tent and barracks. But the British military had another staple in their kit: gin. By the early 19th century, gin was everywhere in the British ranks, a familiar taste from home and a way to take the edge off brutal days. Mixing gin with tonic water wasn't a stroke of genius so much as an inevitability. It was the next logical step in the quest to make survival just a little bit easier. So, the pieces were in place. Malaria had met its match in quinine, and the Empire could keep pushing forward. But the story didn't end there. The struggle to make quinine tolerable was only the beginning. The real transformation came when necessity collided with creativity, and a drink meant for survival started to become something more. Quinine was a lifesaver, but calling it easy to consume would be a joke. Except no one was laughing. This stuff was challenging from the start. The real turning point in this story comes from the bark of a tree growing high in the Andes, cinchona. This bark held a secret weapon: quinine. But the so-called cure was its own kind of punishment. Quinine's taste wasn't just bad. It was metallic, tongue-curling, and so sharp it left your mouth coated in bitterness for hours. If you've ever bitten into grapefruit peel, multiply that by 10 and imagine being told to drink it every single day. Now picture doing that while already sick, sweating through your uniform in the punishing heat, and you start to get why soldiers dreaded their medicine almost as much as malaria itself. You'd think a lifesaver would be welcomed with open arms, but that wasn't the case. Letters and journals from British officers described the ordeal with a kind of exasperation that's almost funny, if it weren't so grim. Some men managed a spoonful before gagging. Others simply refused, even after watching their friends get carried off by fever. The bitterness wasn't just a taste. It was a daily test of willpower, a reminder that survival came with a price. It's hard to blame them. Imagine being tough enough to face a bayonet charge, but brought low by a muddy glass of quinine water. Early attempts to make quinine bearable were clumsy at best. The first idea was sugar, lots of it. Dissolving spoonfuls of sugar into the quinine mixture helped a little, but to really mask the taste, you'd need so much sugar that it became impractical, especially miles from any supply ship. Still, sugar was better than nothing, and it was the first step in turning the daily dose from an ordeal into a routine. But even the most determined sweet tooth couldn't overpower quinine's bite entirely. That's when the British officers remembered another trick already in their arsenal: citrus. Lime juice was standard issue for fighting off scurvy, another invisible enemy lurking in the tropics. Adding lime to the quinine and sugar mixture did two things. First, it cut through the bitterness with a sharp, tart edge that made the drink less punishing. Second, it doubled up on protection, keeping both malaria and scurvy at bay. It wasn't delicious, but it was at least drinkable, a small mercy in a place where comfort was in short supply. British officers in India quickly took to this new concoction, and before long, lime and tonic water became as much a part of the colonial routine as the midday sun. The first versions of tonic water were nothing like what you find in a bottle today. They were flat, cloudy, and still unmistakably bitter. But suddenly, the drink was something a person could face without dreading it all day. The ritual of taking quinine became woven into the daily schedule. In the morning, or before dinner, a glass of tonic water, sometimes with a squeeze of lime and a spoonful of sugar, would make its rounds among officers. It was still medicine, but it was starting to feel like something else. A habit, a bit of structure, even a source of minor comfort. Routine doesn't mean enjoyment, though. Most soldiers still grimaced through their daily glass, and no one was lining up for seconds. But necessity breeds adaptation, and the next step was almost inevitable. If you already had to drink this stuff, why not make it a little more bearable? That's where gin entered the picture. Gin, for a British officer, was more than just a drink. It was familiar, a taste of home, a way to unwind after a day spent wrestling with heat, insects, and the constant threat of illness. It was also practical. Gin traveled well, didn't spoil easily, and had long been used as a medicinal spirit in its own right. Mixing gin into the tonic water wasn't about inventing a new cocktail. It was about making the daily medicine less miserable. The gin dulled the bitterness, softened the edges, and for a moment made the whole experience feel almost civilized. It didn't just help the medicine go down, it turned the ritual into something to look forward to, even if just for a few minutes. The recipe was simple: quinine for malaria, lime for scurvy, sugar to soften the blow, and gin to make it all tolerable. This was not the gin and tonic you order at a bar today, but it had all the essential parts. What started as a chore of survival began to shift into something resembling enjoyment. The line between medicine and pleasure blurred, and the daily dose became a small, hard-won luxury in a world where comfort was rare. But here's a question that lingers. Why gin? Out of all the spirits available to the British, rum, brandy, whiskey, why was gin the one that ended up in the glass with tonic water? The answer to that takes us back before the British Empire's reach stretched across the tropics, to a time and place where gin wasn't British at all. If you trace the story back far enough, you'll find it doesn't start in London, but in the Netherlands, with a very different kind of spirit and a very different purpose. Gin's journey from Dutch medicine to British staple is a story filled with invention, rivalry, and a fair amount of chaos. Before it became the backbone of the gin and tonic, gin had to survive its own transformation, from a medicinal remedy to a drink of the masses, and finally, to something refined enough for officers to sip alongside their daily dose of quinine. And that story begins with the Dutch, a little invention called Geneva, and a group of English soldiers who brought home more than just battle scars. The path from medicine to mayhem starts in the 17th century Netherlands, where apothecaries and distillers were busy experimenting with new ways to blend science and spirits. They came up with Geneva, a clear juniper-flavored liquor with a sharp, piney aroma. This wasn't just a drink. It was sold as medicine, prescribed for everything from kidney stones to stomach aches, and believed to have all sorts of restorative powers. Juniper berries were the star ingredient, not just for their taste, but for their supposed ability to ward off illness. Whether it worked or not is up for debate, but people in the Dutch Republic were convinced they'd bottled a cure. It wasn't long before this medicinal spirit found its way into the hands of Dutch soldiers and sailors. They credited Geneva with steadying their nerves before heading into battle. A shot for courage, a shot for luck. The British, fighting alongside the Dutch during the 80 Years' War, got a taste for it and brought the idea home. But the real turning point came in 1689, when William of Orange, a Dutch prince, took the English throne. Suddenly, Dutch tastes were in fashion. Geneva, with its medicinal reputation, crossed the Channel and began to evolve. Once in England, things changed quickly. English distillers simplified the recipe, ramped up production, and created something new: gin. Unlike its Dutch ancestor, early English gin was cleaner, sharper, and more botanical forward. The juniper was still there, but the spirit was lighter and easier to produce on a large scale. Parliament, eager to support the grain industry, encouraged gin production. The result? Gin became cheap, plentiful, and available to just about everyone. That's where the trouble really started. In the early 18th century, gin wasn't just popular, it was everywhere. London streets filled with shops, stalls, and back rooms selling gin by the mug or bucket. The city was crowded, dirty, and full of people looking for any escape from their daily grind. For many, gin was that escape. It was affordable, potent, and, for a while, completely unregulated. Anyone could make it, anyone could sell it, and anyone could drink it. No questions asked. But cheap gin came with a cost. Many of the gins flooding the market were cut with harmful substances to stretch supplies and boost profits. The quality was unpredictable, and the health effects could be disastrous. Gin became a symbol of the city's decline. Addiction, poverty, and crime all seemed to spiral out of control. public drunkenness soared, infant mortality rates climbed, and the drink earned a new nickname, Mother's Ruin. If you were poor, gin was both a comfort and a curse. If you were wealthy, it was a sign that society itself was coming apart at the seams. Artists and writers of the time didn't hold back. William Hogarth's engraving, Gin Lane, captured the chaos perfectly. Streets overrun with desperate people, children neglected, families falling apart. It wasn't just a warning, it was a snapshot of reality. The government had to step in. Laws were passed to limit production and raise taxes. But the road to reform was rough. Riots broke out. Smuggling became a way of life. Still, over time, tighter regulations and advances in distillation began to change things. Gin slowly shed its reputation as a dangerous street drink. By the 19th century, gin had undergone a transformation. The industrial age brought new technology and stricter standards. Distillers could finally control the process, focusing on quality rather than quantity. This is when London Dry Gin emerged, crisp, balanced, and made with carefully selected botanicals. The syrupy, rough-edged spirits of the past were replaced by something much more refined. Juniper took the lead, backed up by citrus and subtle spices. The result was a spirit that was clean, consistent, and ready for mixing. Gin's new respectability didn't go unnoticed. It found its way into the world of cocktails, where bartenders and drinkers alike embraced its versatility. In clubs and drawing rooms, gin became the base for all sorts of concoctions, mixed with citrus, syrups, and soda water. Drinking gin was no longer about escaping reality. It was about enjoying a well-made spirit, savoring the balance of flavors, and maybe showing off a little sophistication. The drink that had once been blamed for tearing families apart was now a staple of polite society. This shift set the stage for a new kind of pairing, one born out of necessity but refined by taste. British officers stationed in far-flung colonies were already in the habit of taking their daily dose of quinine to stave off malaria. The tonic water was still bitter, even with sugar and lime, but the addition of gin changed everything. Suddenly, the medicine became a ritual. The sharpness of the gin balanced the bitterness of the tonic, while lime added a bright note and a bit of extra protection against scurvy. What started as a chore turned into a moment of relief, a way to mark the end of another long, sweltering day. It's easy to imagine the scene. Officers gathered in the shade, sweating through their uniforms, each with a glass in hand. The gin and tonic wasn't just a drink, it was a symbol, a reminder of home, a shield against disease, and a small luxury in a world that offered few comforts. The pairing made sense. Gin was clean and botanical, tonic water was medicinal and bracing, and together they created something greater than the sum of their parts. With gin's rough edges smoothed out and tonic water finally tamed, the two stories merged. What had started as medicine and mayhem had become a ritual of survival and a mark of status. But the story of the gin and tonic doesn't end with a glass in the officers' club. There's another chapter, one set in the heat and glare of the empire's farthest frontiers, where the drink became more than a cure. It became a daily necessity. Step into British India in the mid-19th century. You're sweating before breakfast, the air so thick it feels like you're breathing through a wet towel. The only thing moving faster than the heat are the mosquitoes, everywhere, relentless, and carrying a threat you can't see. Malaria is never far from your mind. It's not a question of if, but when. This is the backdrop for daily life, where every routine matters just a little more than it ever did back home. For British officers and administrators, each day was a careful balance between endurance and longing. There was the constant physical discomfort, shirts clinging to your back, the drone of insects, the ever-present risk of a single bite leading to days of fever. But there was also the quieter ache of homesickness, a longing for the cool evenings and familiar faces of England. Routines became lifelines. In this world, the gin and tonic wasn't just a drink. By the mid-19th century, it had become a daily ritual, one that marked the transition from the heat and chaos of the day to the relative calm of evening. At twilight, officers would gather their supplies, gin, tonic water, ice if they were lucky, and a wedge of lime. The preparation itself was a kind of ceremony, a small act of control in a place where so much was unpredictable. Quinine, by now, was a non-negotiable part of survival. If you wanted to keep malaria at bay, you drank your tonic, no matter how bitter. But the taste was always a challenge. Sugar helped. Lime helped more. And then there was gin, familiar, bracing, and just strong enough to take the edge off. The gin and tonic wasn't about pleasure, it was about making the medicine go down, and about reclaiming a sliver of normalcy at the end of the day. You'd watch the sun dip behind the trees, glass in hand, feeling for a moment like you'd found a loophole in the day's discomfort. The ritual spread. Exclusive officers' clubs became centers for the gin and tonic routine, reinforcing a sense of community and helping everyone keep up appearances. Here, the drink was more than a survival tool. It was a badge of belonging, a sign that, despite the heat and the distance from home, you were still part of something bigger. The act of mixing the drink, passing around the ice bucket, and squeezing a fresh lime into a tall glass became a shared language. It was a way to mark time, to draw a line between the hardships of the day and the brief, cooler calm of evening. Lime played a starring role in this ritual. The British Navy had already learned the hard way about the dangers of scurvy, and citrus became a symbol of practical survival. Limes, with their sharp, sour flavor, did more than just improve the taste. They offered a dose of vitamin C, helping to keep another ancient enemy at bay. The nickname limeys stuck to British sailors for a reason. Adding lime to the gin and tonic wasn't just about taste or tradition. It was about preserving health, using whatever tools were available in unfamiliar territory. The drink, in this way, became a blend of necessity and adaptation, a mix of European science, indigenous knowledge, and whatever the local markets could provide. The gin and tonic was never just about the ingredients. It was about the act of making it, the moment of pause it created, and the sense of order it imposed on a disorderly world. In the officers' clubs and hill stations, the drink became a daily marker, the one thing you could count on to be the same, no matter how much the world outside changed from day to day. It was a fragile comfort, a ritual that made the unfamiliar just a little more bearable. Then came a quiet revolution. In 1858, Erasmus Bond patented the first carbonated tonic water in England. Suddenly, the tonic wasn't just bitter and flat. It was fizzy, refreshing, and much easier to swallow. The arrival of Schweppes commercial tonic water in the 1870s made the drink even more accessible, both in the colonies and back in Britain. Refrigeration improved, and with it came the luxury of real ice, even in the hottest climates. The gin and tonic, once a bitter necessity, started to look and taste like something you might actually want to drink. This shift changed everything. Officers could now enjoy a cold, sparkling gin and tonic at the end of the day, the bubbles cutting through the heaviness of the air, the lime adding a sharp burst of flavor, and the ice turning the whole experience into something almost decadent. The drink was still a tool for survival, but it was also a symbol, a sign that you could carve out a little comfort even in the most challenging places. It became a fixture at social gatherings, a marker of status, and a way for the colonial elite to reinforce their sense of order and civility. The gin and tonic story is tangled up with the story of empire itself. It's a paradox in a glass, a drink born from hardship and adaptation, built on the knowledge and resources of many cultures, and consumed as both a necessity and a luxury. The bitterness of quinine, the sharpness of lime, the familiar burn of gin, all these elements came together to create something that was more than the sum of its parts. For British officers and administrators, the gin and tonic was a daily reminder that survival and comfort could sometimes be found in the same ritual. Of course, the world didn't stand still. By the early 20th century, the role of quinine began to change. Synthetic anti-malarials started to replace it, and the medical urgency behind the drink faded. But the gin and tonic had already taken on a life of its own. It had moved beyond its origins, becoming a symbol of leisure, refinement, and a certain kind of cool resilience. So what turned the gin and tonic from a colonial remedy into a drink of choice? And how did a glass meant for survival become a staple of bars and backyards around the world? There's more to the story, and it all starts with something as simple as ice. The gin and tonic's evolution from a colonial survival tool to a drink of leisure is a story of small changes that added up to something much bigger. By the mid-19th century, the daily ritual of gin, quinine, and lime had become a fixture in British colonial life. But it was never truly about enjoyment, at least not at first. The drink was flat, warm, and bitter, more a means to an end than anything resembling pleasure. That all started to shift with a few key innovations. First, there was ice. For decades, a cold drink in the tropics was a fantasy, unless you were among the privileged few with access to imported ice. But as refrigeration technology improved and ice shipments from cooler climates became more reliable, something changed. Suddenly, officers and settlers could drop a few cubes into their glass and experience a drink that was actually refreshing. The difference was immediate. A chilled gin and tonic took the edge off the heat, dulled the bitterness of quinine, and let the lime and botanicals shine through. What had been a daily ordeal was now, for the first time, something you might actually look forward to. But the real breakthrough came with carbonation. In 1858, Erasmus Bond patented the first commercial carbonated tonic water. This was a game changer. Instead of mixing up flat homemade concoctions, people could now buy tonic water that fizzed and sparkled. It was lighter, brighter, and somehow more modern. Just a couple of decades later, Schweppes launched its own mass-market tonic water, bottling that refreshing bitterness for anyone who wanted it. From Bond's first carbonated tonic in 1858 to Schweppes' mass-market launch in the 1870s, bubbly tonic became widely available. Now, you didn't need a servant or a bar kit to make your daily drink, just a bottle, a glass, and a splash of gin. This commercial tonic water didn't just make life easier, it changed the whole meaning of the gin and tonic. Suddenly, the drink was consistent, accessible, and, most importantly, pleasant. The fizz lifted the flavors, making the bitterness of quinine less punishing and turning the drink into something you might sip slowly, even savor. The ritual of mixing gin, tonic, ice, and lime became a small luxury, a way to mark the end of the day with something that felt civilized. It didn't take long for the gin and tonic to travel beyond the verandas of colonial outposts. The drink caught on in Britain, where it showed up everywhere from garden parties to yacht clubs. You'd see it at summer gatherings, on ocean liners, and in the lounges of city hotels. The association with empire faded, replaced by an air of easy sophistication. By the early 20th century, the gin and tonic was no longer about malaria or the tropics. It was a drink for anyone who wanted something crisp and cool at the end of a long day. Meanwhile, medicine was moving on. Synthetic anti-malarials replaced quinine as the standard treatment for malaria. The urgency that once defined the gin and tonic faded, but the drink itself stuck around. People had grown to like the taste, the dry bitterness, the snap of lime, the gentle floral notes of gin. Tonic water still included a small dose of quinine, but now it was there for the flavor, not the cure. The gin and tonic had outgrown its original purpose. Refrigeration and carbonation didn't just change the drink, they changed what it meant to relax. The sound of ice cubes in a glass, the fizz of tonic, the sharp scent of lime. These became the markers of leisure and comfort. For the middle and working classes in Britain, the gin and tonic offered a taste of something special, a little upgrade to the everyday. For the wealthy, it became a staple at social clubs, garden parties, and on the decks of ocean liners. The drink's simplicity made it easy for anyone to prepare, and its distinctive flavor made it hard to mistake for anything else. Pop culture took notice. Novels and films from the early 20th century often featured characters enjoying a gin and tonic at sunset or during a summer evening, the drink serving as shorthand for elegance and ease. The old colonial associations faded into the background, replaced by a new image, the gin and tonic as a symbol of calm, cool sophistication. It was a drink that bridged worlds, bitter and sweet, medicinal and indulgent, old and new. But the gin and tonic's adaptability is what really set it apart. As the British Empire receded and the world changed, the drink kept moving. Soldiers, travelers, and expats carried it to new places. American cocktail culture picked it up after Prohibition, and in Europe, it found a home in cafes and hotel bars. Wherever it went, it fit in. Never flashy, but always distinctive, always reliable. It was as much at home in a Parisian rooftop bar as it was in a humid club in Singapore. Its contradictions, refreshing but bitter, simple but with a complicated past, made it endlessly adaptable. By the middle of the 20th century, the gin and tonic was a fixture. Cocktail books listed it as a classic. Bartenders argued over the perfect proportions and the best garnish. Pre-bottled tonic water and reliable ice made it foolproof, and its flavor profile ensured it was never mistaken for something else. The gin and tonic had become more than a drink. It was a ritual, a sign of good taste and a link to a complicated history that most people had stopped thinking about. Yet, the gin and tonic never really left the spotlight. Even as trends came and went, it held its ground, steady, familiar, and always just a little bit different depending on where you found it. The drink's appeal wasn't just about nostalgia or habit. It was about the way it balanced history, necessity, and pleasure in a single glass. That balance is what kept it relevant, even as the world moved on. And while the gin and tonic's roots are tangled up in empire and medicine, its story didn't end there. The drink kept evolving, finding new life and new fans in places far removed from its colonial origins. The next chapter isn't about survival or routine. It's about reinvention, creativity, and the surprising ways a simple drink can keep finding its place in the world. The gin and tonic didn't claw its way back into the spotlight by chasing trends or chasing nostalgia. For much of the 20th century, it was the drink you'd find quietly holding court at the end of the bar, reliable, familiar, and maybe a little bit old-fashioned. Your grandparents probably had a bottle of gin in the cupboard and a few dusty bottles of tonic in the pantry, ready for a quiet evening or a family gathering. But then, without much warning, the gin and tonic started showing up again. Only this time, it wasn't content to play the background. By the early 21st century, it was everywhere, and it was different. The gin and tonic had become the centerpiece of a global revival. This shift wasn't just about new advertising or a sudden collective craving. It started with gin itself. For decades, most people associated gin with a handful of big brands: London Dry, Juniper Heavy, and more or less interchangeable. You knew what you were getting every time. Predictable, sometimes a little sharp, and not much to write home about. Then came the craft gin movement. Small distilleries began popping up, determined to put their own stamp on the spirit. These weren't just copycats. They were experimenters, using local herbs, fruits, and spices to create gins that tasted and smelled like nowhere else on earth. Imagine a gin that smells like a Tasmanian forest after the rain, or one that tastes faintly of Japanese yuzu and green tea. Suddenly, gin wasn't just gin anymore. It was a story in a bottle, and every new label had something to say. This new wave of gin didn't just change the flavor, it changed the ritual. You could walk into a bar and choose from a dozen gins, each with its own blend of botanicals: South African Cape gooseberries, Australian pepperberries, Japanese yuzu, or even Scottish heather. The labels got more artistic, the bottles more striking. Gin became a way to show off local pride, to experiment, to create something with a sense of place. It was a spirit that could be endlessly reimagined, and people wanted to taste what was possible. But gin wasn't the only thing getting a facelift. Tonic water, once an afterthought, started to matter just as much. Gone were the days of a single, cloyingly sweet, one-size-fits-all mixer. Modern tonics dialed down the sugar, refined the quinine bite, and highlighted complementary botanicals. Tonic became as nuanced as the gin itself, with varieties tailored for different styles: floral, citrusy, spicy, or even herbal. Suddenly, picking your tonic was just as important as picking your gin. It was all about balance: bubbles that were crisp but not overpowering, sweetness that didn't overwhelm, and bitterness that lingered just long enough to keep things interesting. With this kind of choice, the gin and tonic stopped being a default drink and started becoming a canvas. Bartenders and home enthusiasts alike leaned into the possibilities. No more limp lime wedge and a handful of melting ice. Now, you'd see a tall glass filled with cold, clear cubes, a precise pour of gin, and tonic fizzing gently as it hit the glass. Garnishes weren't just for show. Pink peppercorns, a sprig of rosemary, a twist of grapefruit peel, or a ribbon of cucumber, each one chosen to highlight a specific note in the gin or tonic. The drink became a little performance. Every detail considered, every ingredient a chance to say something new. If you want a sense of how far this ritual has come, look to Spain. In cities like Barcelona and Madrid, the gin and tonic is more than a drink. It's an event. Bars serve gin tonics in giant balloon glasses, packed with ice, layered with botanicals, and matched with the perfect tonic. Bartenders take their time, pairing flavors and garnishes with the kind of care you'd expect from a chef. There's a quiet pride in the way the drink is assembled. The careful pour, the soft fizz as tonic meets gin, the placement of a garnish just so. It's a small ceremony, a pause in the noise, and people come for the show as much as for the taste. Elsewhere, the drink keeps evolving. Japanese distilleries craft gins with local botanicals, yuzu, sancho pepper, cherry blossom, and serve them with tonic and garnishes that echo the flavors of the region. The result is a gin and tonic that tastes unmistakably Japanese, clean and bright, with a citrus lift that sets it apart. These global twists aren't about chasing novelty for its own sake. They're about making the drink feel rooted, personal, and alive. What's remarkable is how the gin and tonic manages to feel both new and familiar at the same time. Its basic structure hasn't changed. A dry spirit, a bittersweet mixer, a squeeze of citrus, and plenty of ice. But within that framework, there's room for endless creativity. The bitterness of quinine, once a reminder of medicine, now adds complexity. The botanicals in the gin, once chosen for necessity, now tell stories of landscape and tradition. The garnish, once just a wedge of lime, is a final touch, a flash of color, a burst of aroma, a subtle nod to the drink's roots. There's something calming about the ritual, too. Maybe it's the sound of ice tumbling into a glass, or the way tonic sparkles as it's poured. Maybe it's the quiet moment as you watch a slice of grapefruit or a sprig of rosemary settle on top. The process isn't fussy. It's measured, almost meditative. You don't need a recipe book or a shaker, just a little attention, a little care, and a willingness to enjoy the moment. In a world that rarely slows down, the gin and tonic offers a pause, a way to mark the end of the day, to gather your thoughts, to savor something simple and good. The drink's resurgence isn't just about taste. It's about connection. People want to know where their gin comes from, what botanicals went into it, how the tonic was made. They want to feel a link to the place, the process, the story. Craft gin distillers and tonic makers oblige, printing the details on every bottle, sharing the inspiration behind each blend. The gin and tonic, once a drink of necessity, is now a drink of curiosity, a way to explore, to experiment, to learn. Yet for all its reinvention, the gin and tonic never loses its balance. Dry meets sweet, bitter meets bright, old meets new. That's the secret to its staying power. It adapts, but it never forgets where it came from. The drink that started as a lifeline in the tropics is now a fixture in bars and homes around the world, from Spanish terraces to Tokyo rooftops. It's a drink that invites you in, lets you make it your own, and rewards you with something that feels both timeless and modern. As you take that first sip, the cold, the fizz, the subtle bitterness, the lift of citrus, it's easy to forget just how much history is packed into a single glass. The gin and tonic may look simple, but it carries the weight of centuries: medicine, empire, adaptation, and now creativity and calm. It's more than a drink. It's a story, one that keeps unfolding one glass at a time. But if you look a little closer, you'll see that the gin and tonic is more than just a symbol of leisure or a showcase for craft. Its story is tangled up with the world's story, a reflection of how people adapt, borrow, and build on what came before. And that's where things get complicated. When you hold a gin and tonic, you're holding more than a drink. You're holding a piece of history layered with contradictions. The gin and tonic's appeal is easy to see on the surface. It's crisp, refreshing, and just bitter enough to keep things interesting. But the story behind that glass is anything but simple. It's a story of survival, adaptation, and the uneven exchanges that shaped its history. The drink's legacy is marked by two big paradoxes: who gets the credit and what the drink really means. Let's start with the first. The gin and tonic was born out of necessity in the British colonies, but its most important ingredient, quinine, was never a British discovery. The Quechua people of the Andes were the first to use the bark of the cinchona tree to treat fevers, relying on generations of knowledge to find relief in a hostile environment. They passed their understanding along, using the bark as medicine long before anyone in Europe had even heard of it. When Europeans arrived, they recognized the bark's power, but instead of honoring its origins, they absorbed it into their own story. The British, facing malaria in the tropics, took the knowledge, extracted the quinine, and built a new ritual around it. That's the pattern you see again and again in the history of empire. Indigenous knowledge is borrowed, repackaged, and credited elsewhere. This is where the gin and tonic's legacy gets complicated. It's a drink built on adaptation, but also on erasure. The British needed a way to make quinine drinkable, so they added sugar and lime, both products of colonies, both tied to systems of forced labor and exploitation. Gin, familiar and comforting, was the final ingredient. The result was a drink that worked. It helped keep malaria at bay, and it gave British officers a moment of relief in a world that often felt unlivable. But underneath the ritual, you find the reality of how it all came together. Knowledge taken, resources extracted, labor exploited. The gin and tonic is a product of human ingenuity, but it's also a reminder of how uneven those exchanges were. The second paradox is about what the drink became. The gin and tonic started as medicine, bitter, functional, and absolutely necessary. It was the difference between life and death in the colonies. A daily ritual that marked the end of another day survived. The bitterness of quinine was a constant reminder of why you were drinking it in the first place. Yet over time, the drink changed. As refrigeration and carbonation made the gin and tonic more pleasant, and as the threat of malaria faded, the ritual shifted from survival to pleasure. What was once a grim necessity became a symbol of leisure, of sophistication, even of luxury. This shift didn't erase the drink's origins. The taste of quinine still lingers, faint but unmistakable, a whisper of the medicine it used to be. The ritual of mixing gin, tonic, ice, and lime still echoes the routines of colonial officers. even if you're just standing in your kitchen after a long day. But now, the drink is just as likely to show up at a rooftop party in Tokyo or a bustling bar in Barcelona. Far from its beginnings as a tool of empire, the gin and tonic has become a canvas for creativity, a drink that changes with the times but never quite loses its original edge. These contradictions are what make the gin and tonic's legacy so rich and so uneasy. It's easy to celebrate the drink's transformation from medicine to pleasure, from colonial necessity to global icon. But the truth is, every glass carries the marks of its past. The gin and tonic wouldn't exist without the knowledge and resources of indigenous people, without the forced labor that grew the sugar and limes, without the ambitions of a colonial empire trying to keep its grip on the world. Those aren't just details. They're the foundation of the drink itself. So, what do you do with that knowledge? Some people might say you can't enjoy a gin and tonic once you know the story behind it. Others might argue that history is always complicated, and that every tradition is built on layers of both ingenuity and injustice. The answer probably lies somewhere in between. Recognizing the drink's origins doesn't mean you have to give it up. But it does mean you drink it with your eyes open, aware of the hands and histories that brought it to your glass. There's something honest about the gin and tonic's refusal to hide its past. The bitterness is still there, softened, but not erased. The ritual is still there, even if it's been transformed by time and taste. The drink's popularity today is a testament to how people adapt and reimagine what they inherit. In Japan, bartenders might garnish a gin and tonic with a twist of yuzu, giving it a new identity while nodding to the drink's history. In Spain, the drink has become an art form, served in balloon glasses with botanicals and citrus, a far cry from the colonial outposts where it began. Each new version is a reminder that the gin and tonic is never just one thing. At the same time, the drink's global journey is a lesson in how cultures borrow, blend, and build on what came before. The gin and tonic story is a story of exchange, sometimes fair, often not. It's a timeline of human creativity and survival, but also of the inequalities that shape the modern world. The drink is a paradox in a glass. It soothes and stings, comforts and unsettles, connects and divides. If you're sitting with a gin and tonic in hand, it's worth pausing for a moment. Think about the bark stripped from Andean trees, the hands that harvested sugar cane and limes, the officers who turned medicine into ritual, and the generations who have adapted the drink to their own tastes. Each sip is a reminder that history doesn't just live in books. It shows up in the things we do, the rituals we keep, and the flavors we chase. So, next time you take a sip, remember what's in your glass. It's more than a cocktail. It's a little bit of the past, a little bit of the present, and a taste of the complicated world we all share. Today, the gin and tonic appears in glasses from Tokyo rooftops to Spanish gin bars, thriving far from its beginnings as a colonial remedy. It's remarkable that something born from bitter bark and survival now signals modern sophistication. Its journey reminds us that even the most elegant traditions often rise from unlikely, sometimes uncomfortable beginnings. History leaves its fingerprints everywhere, even in what we drink. If you've enjoyed this gentle journey through history, please like, subscribe, and share your own favorite cocktail origins in the comments. Next time you sip a gin and tonic, what hidden stories, much you taste.